And now to introduce our 2 o'clock Interfaith Lecture Series here in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we are presenting the theme, Crisis of Faith, ? Our distinguished guests today are Bill Moyers and Rabbi Sid Schwarz. As we continue with this important week-long conversation, I know that you will all agree that we are enormously blessed to have with us both Rabbi Sid and Bill Moyers, who is our moderator for the week, and Bill will do the honors of introducing Sid to all of us today. You will be pleased to know that Rabbi Schwarz will be doing a book signing on the porch of the Hall of Missions immediately after this presentation, and that his books will be sold there as well. He is the author of Jewish Megatrends. The title of his presentation now is Religion, Identity, and Communities of Meaning, and we are greatly looking forward to it. May I also say that we all look forward as well to Bill Moyers here tomorrow, as he will help us to make sense of all that we have heard this week. And then to our town hall meeting here at 3:30 tomorrow in the Hall of Philosophy, when Bill and Robert Franklin and Shara Babcock will help to bring our week-long conversation to enlightened closure. May it be so. We are grateful to the Eileen and Warren Martin Lectureship for Emerging Studies in Bible and Theology for providing support for this week's Interfaith Lecture Series. We are delighted that both Bill Moyers and Sid Schwarz are here with us today, and so I now ask you to please join me in giving them a very warm and appreciative Chautauqua welcome.
Thank you very much, Maureen, and thank you for coming out. Just as yesterday, Greg Epstein remained in the House of Mission to pray that it wouldn't rain. Sid did that today, and we've had the second straight day without rain, the power of prayer from different sources. You please turn off your cell phones. I won't turn mine off. I've been leaving it on so I could fact check the speakers. But it's permanently tuned to Wikipedia. To frame this gathering, I want first to share with you a slice of history, a parochial slice of history with, I think, implications that are universal, certainly applicable to this afternoon. I want to take you to the small town of Marshall, Texas, where I grew up on the border of Louisiana. It was a frontier town in Texas's early days, the 1840s and 50s. It was the first the first mail route in Texas. I think the email will get there in about 10 years. The first telegraph in Texas appeared there in 1854. The stagecoach connected the town to Austin, El Paso, New Orleans, and San Diego. And in 1858, developers laid 20 miles of track near town to connect the city to steamboat traffic that came up from New Orleans on then to the Red River, and then over to Caddo Lake. This opened the town to dry goods and commodities of all kinds, which had to be shipped from New Orleans. Transportation brought trade, and trade brought prosperity. Jews were among the first settlers looking to join and expand our economy. In 1900, our local newspaper noted that when Marshall was in its infancy, when walking 2 blocks from the public square, one would find himself in the woods. There were Jews in Marshall who did their full part in the pioneer work of laying the foundations for a splendid city. The Doppelmayr brothers, Meyer and Daniel, German immigrants, opened a confectionery. The Kahn family came from Germany and entered the retail business. But the growing merchant community was disrupted, like everything else, by the Civil War. Some of the Jews in Marshall fought for the Confederacy, and others joined the Union forces. Just like other families, Jewish brother fought Jewish brother. And it was, in this case, the Doppelmayers against the Kahns. After the war, they came home. Others arrived. Isaac Wolff moved to Marshall from upstate New York, worked as a clerk, and wrote back to relatives urging them to come and join him. Mary Doppelmayer, the sister of Meyer and Daniel, immigrated from Syracuse by paying for her ticket with the money she won in a lottery. Mary Doppelmayer married Joe Weissman. He and Daniel Doppelmayer opened Weissman's department store, the finest in town, which was still thriving when I graduated from high school. My mother worked there. She was a clerk, and she had a strong arm because she had to pull the chain to release the pneumatic tube that took the chain back up to the clerk who had sent the original invoice down to her. The Kahn family signed a contract with the railroad company to provide groceries for dining cars once the newfangled steam engines began bringing passengers through town. By the turn of the century, Marshall enjoyed such prosperity for that time that the Industrial Removal Office, you know what that was? Selected Marshall as an area to send poor New York City Jews who needed and wanted to work. As Jews in Marshall prospered, they began to develop a rich religious life. They founded the Hebrew Benevolent Society in 1868. Rabbi Greenblatt fled the yellow epidemic that struck Shreveport just 30 miles away and came to Marshall to preside over high holiday celebrations for 10 of Marshall's Jewish families. The Jewish men in town established Reuben Lodge number 257 of B'nai B'rith in 1876. And in 1877, Mrs. Goldstein began to teach a Sabbath school in both Hebrew and English. She and other Jewish women organized the Hebrew Ladies' Aid Society in 1882 to assist poor Jewish families in East Texas. Now, they made many efforts to integrate into the larger community, but they didn't wish to assimilate totally. Hattie Saff, daughter of a rabbi, attended a Catholic school, won an award for being the best pupil of the week, and received as her prize a chain. Attached to the chain was a cross. Her father made her return the prize and politely explain to the priest that Jews do not wear crosses. Oh, he said, his name was Father Granger. Oh, Father Granger said, I apologize, and gave her a round metal prize instead, which she wore proudly. Isaac Huckwell, who had been adopted from a family in New Orleans, was elected president of the East Texas Council of Boy Scouts and became the father of organized baseball in East Texas when he started a baseball league. He was the only citizen in the history of America to receive a lifetime pass to all major league baseball parks. But what most of all they wanted was a synagogue. They prayed for it, they worked for it, they organized for it. And they announced that they were going to build one. They bought a lot on the corner of Fulton and Burleson, not far from where I lived. The Christians in town not only applauded, but turned out for the fundraising. Several Christian women took leading roles in the effort. And in 1900, the August of 1900, almost 117 years ago, the synagogue opened with a Middle Eastern architectural style that added uniquely to the landscape, but was at odds with the Yellowstone Southern Courthouse, with its curves and corners and balconies before which stood the statue of Johnny Reb, hero of the Confederacy. The third most striking building in town was the First Methodist Church, built by slaves, and slaves were allowed to worship there, but only by sitting in the balcony. The synagogue became the center of Jewish life in Marshall. A masquerade ball in 1909 raised money for a new organ. The Great Depression hit hit our town very hard. But the Temple Sisterhood cut up pounds of brisket, chuck roast, tomatoes, and chili peppers to make Mabel Stein's hot tamales, and then sold them to help pay not only for a temple annex in 1939, but for a fund for the poor. Lewis Carroll ran a successful shoe store and served as mayor from 1935 to 1947. His shoes were so good, I'm still wearing a pair. He and his wife Audrey became good friends of my parents. Adolf Katz and his family escaped from Nazi Germany and found waiting arms in Marshall, where Adolf went to work for Lewis at his shoe store. But in the 1950s and early 60s, growing cities like Dallas and Houston, with markets like Neiman Marcus, proved irresistible to the younger members of the Jewish community. And at its peak, the synagogue had served 50 families. Now there are only 15. Today, there's one. The Sisterhood and Ladies' Aid Society stopped holding regular meetings, and the temple stopped holding Sabbath school. The spirit and vitality of the temple fell victim to demographics, migration, and old age, the age of transition. The shrinking Jewish community still made important contributions. Lewis Carroll's wife, Audrey, became mayor after him and led a drive of Jewish and Christian women to create a public library in town, our first, and to establish a symphony league, also our first. But the Montefiore Temple could not survive, and on the 4th of May, 1973, it was demolished to be replaced by the police and fire complex. I never go home and drive by the corner of Fulton and Burleson without thinking of the Carrolls, the Wisemans, the Hockwalls, the Katzes, the Blooms, and others who became a vital community within a community. Something irreplaceable was lost when that synagogue was demolished and when the town lost the Jews. That synagogue was a place of worship, but also of compassion, intellect, and what the Jewish word, I never pronounce it right, chokmah, which means wisdom. It was a place of compassion, intelligence, and wisdom. I tell you this story as an introduction to Rabbi Schwarz. You will get the connection, hopefully, as you listen to what Sid has to share with us. Because what happened in Marshall, Texas, is not an isolated story. It is very much a metaphor for our times. Rabbi Schwarz is a social entrepreneur, author, and teacher. He created and directs the Clergy Leadership Incubator, a program that trains rabbis to be visionary spiritual leaders. And he also created and directs the Kanisa, Communities of Meaning Network, which aims to build the capacity of emerging spiritual communities across the country. He founded and led the Institute for Jewish Leadership and Values for 21 years, received the prestigious Covenant Award for his pioneering work in the field of Jewish education, and was named by Newsweek as one of the 50 most influential rabbis in North America. He holds a PhD in Jewish history and is the author of 3 groundbreaking books: Finding a Spiritual Home, How a New Generation of Jews Can Transform the American Synagogue; Judaism and Justice, The Jewish Passion to Repair the World; and his latest, which he will be signing this afternoon, Jewish Megatrends, Charting the Course of the American Jewish Future. Immediately after this afternoon, he's leaving for Marshall, Texas to found a new synagogue. Rabbi.
Bill, I'm not sure, does my wife know this? Bill, thank you for that gracious introduction, and it's such an honor to be with you here at Chautauqua. This is my 4th visit. I've been a guest of the Everett House several years ago, in the past couple of years, the guest of the Chautauqua Hebrew congregation. So at this point, I'm starting to see some familiar faces in the crowd, which is always comforting. I see some friends and families from my home congregation, Adat Shalom congregation in Bethesda, Maryland. So thank you for having me. And it's especially humbling to be on this podium, or shall I say, pulpit, that has seen some of the greatest greatest thinkers and spiritual leaders in America over many, many decades. I want to acknowledge and thank the leadership of Reverend Robert Franklin for his hospitality, for Maureen Raveno for her work in making all this happen, and a special shout out and recognition of Bill Moyers. I had never met Bill until this week, and I just think, first of all, calling you a journalist is like calling Michael Jordan a basketball player. Really. The category is correct, but in no way conveys the level of virtuosity and excellence that Bill brings to his craft in telling the American story for many decades. And he brings it as well with a certain moral clarity, which I just have found so inspiring this week. I think that we all owe him a debt of gratitude to making this week as rich as it has been. Bill. I got here on Tuesday because I wanted to hear some of the lectures, and I'm staying to hear Bill's talk tomorrow. I got here on Buffalo Day, which was interesting, very special. And I guess today is Rabbi Day at Chautauqua. How many people heard Rabbi Jonathan Sachs this morning? Oh my gosh, amazing. I'm not sure how often Chautauqua has hosted two rabbis as main speakers on the same day. I'm not sure very often. Yesterday I was walking around the grounds, and you know Chautauquans are very friendly. So I got to talking to an older woman who's been here many, many years, and she says, "What brings you here?" I said, "Well, I'm a rabbi and I'm speaking tomorrow." And she was very astute. She had studied the entire week's schedule in advance. She says, "Oh, which one are you?" So I hesitated for a second. I knew who was the morning speaker. I said, "I'm the rabbi who does not have a British accent, who has never been the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, and who's never been knighted by the Queen of England," which pretty much is another way to introduce me today. Fortunately, I found the talk very inspiring, and I think hopefully you'll find my talk as an appropriate postscript to much of what Rabbi Sachs put out there this morning. I told a friend of mine that I was going to have this opportunity to speak at Chautauqua, and I said, it's kind of like preparing a high holiday sermon at my synagogue, with perhaps two exceptions. The first is that one of the rules of synagogues is that no one ever sits in the first row. It's the 11th commandment. So coming here, having seen the first row filled early, is an exception. The other exception is, in synagogues, if you know synagogues, no one is ever on time. So to come here yesterday at 1:15 and not find a single seat in the hall is kind of comforting. And I'm hoping that the Jews in the audience go back home and say, you can get there on time, it's okay, you won't die. So I want to offer a few words before I speak, mainly in the way of definition. The week's theme is crisis of faith, and my talk is called Religion, Identity, and Communities of Meaning. And what I want to share with you is that the categories that are used to describe Christianity in America are not adequate to explain and describe the American Jewish experience. Now, don't get me wrong, Jews do interfaith work quite well. As a minority culture, we know how to adopt and adapt to the terms and definitions of the majority Christian culture. So we do that quite well. And yet, to use the Christian categories is to keep large parts of the American Jewish experience behind the curtain. You see, Jews are less a community of faith than they are a community of fate. A community of faith defines itself by a certain theology, by doctrines, by certain common ways of worshiping and engaging in ritual. A community of faith defines itself as a peoplehood. It shares a sense of common history and a sense of common destiny. More important than any doctrinal agreement on which there is little around things like God or worship and ritual, on which Jews, for the most part, do not agree. The commonalities that bind and unite American Jews for over 100 years are actually much more historical, cultural, and sociological. The phrase that comes from the Talmud, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Bazeh, which means all of Israel is responsible one for the other, is far more a common assumption and ethos than any piece of theological or liturgical doctrine. What has united American Jews for the better part of their experience here in America are three things: the Holocaust, a sense of advancing social justice in society, and the state of Israel. Let me say a few words about each, because I need to define that for you to understand the rest of my presentation. The Holocaust is unifying because, number one, it is so deeply scarred an entire generation of Jews, and more than just one generation. It describes an experience that Jews have had not once, not twice, but dozens of times throughout our history. It speaks to the precariousness of the Jewish condition, which is deeply built into our Jewish DNA. So look at Jewish history. At any given point in time, Jews could live in a given land and be secure and confident for a time. But one day, a new regime, a new ruler could bring about persecution, banishment, and or death. The Shoah, the Holocaust, is simply, put that in quotes, the most horrendous example of that phenomenon which has occurred so much throughout Jewish history. And out of the Holocaust experience comes the phrase, never again, which you need to understand because it has an intended double meaning. Initially, never again was coined to say, we as Jews need to organize ourselves in such a way politically so that never again will this happen to us. But very quickly in the consciousness of Jews, it came to mean that never again should this persecution, this intolerance, this hatred, this obscenity called totalitarianism and intolerance, never again should this happen to anyone, which has led Jews to become so active on issues of human rights throughout the world. That leads to the second point, social justice. So if you know a little bit about the Torah, the word we use for our Bible, for our holy texts, deeply in the texts of the Bible are teachings of the prophets about protecting the stranger, the orphan, the widow. That's true. But add to that the fact that because Jews have told stories over the generations, how oftentimes we have been the persecuted, we have been the vulnerable, we have been the at-risk population, Jews have developed a very finely tuned antenna to other peoples, other communities, other faiths, other races who are facing similar circumstances in our own day and time. And that is why, just if we take the American Jewish experience, it is why Jews have been in the leadership of so many progressive movements for social justice. The labor movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, American public education, LGBT rights, environmental movements. In every one of those movements, there's a remarkable history of Jews playing leadership roles as activists, as funders, and as organizers. And third, the state of Israel. Part of being a community of faith is that when Jews lost their sovereign independence with the destruction of the temple in the year 70 of the Common Era, Jews had to take a national culture and civilization and make it portable so they could travel around the world with it, which is why most nations experience Jews as a community of faith. But it, again, masqueraded what we really were. And the creation and the rebirth of the State of Israel in 1948 allowed Jews to re-enter history as a full nation, a full culture, and a full civilization. So even though in our own day and age, Jews may disagree about the policies of one government of Israel or another, notwithstanding that fact, the state of Israel represents the Jewish entry into the community of nations, and it represents our ability to control our own destiny and have our own national sovereignty. That then is the background for me to talk about what this week has been called the crisis of faith in the Jewish community, but might be more accurately defined as, in the Jewish community, a crisis of continuity. How do we keep this thing going? Now, I bring to this conversation both two qualifications, in a sense. On the one hand, I'm a student of the American Jewish experience, but on the other hand, I'm also a practitioner. I'm not an academic. I've been hands-on in the community. I've served as the rabbi of two different congregations, right now as the founding rabbi of Adat Shalom in Bethesda. About 20 years ago, I published a book called Finding a Spiritual Home, which is essentially a recipe for how American synagogues need to change if they're going to survive the changing cultural norms in America and among American Jews. And so for 20 years, I've been working as a consultant to dozens of synagogues around the country, helping them kind of move into the next era. And finally, over the past decade, I've been developing leadership programs for rabbis and communal leaders that are used across the denominational spectrum. I want to tell you the Jewish story as a way to provide a window into understanding a larger American story. So my case study, if you will be the Jewish experience, which I know the best. But I want to, and several times in this presentation, I want to draw analogies to what it tells us about what's happening in America writ large. And the Jewish story I can best tell in a generational way. And I'm going to do it somewhat autobiographically because I, as a boomer, born in 1953, am the sandwich generation between my parents' generation and my children, and it will tell you a lot about the crisis of faith or the crisis of continuity that we face. My parents are both European-born. My father was born in Berlin. He left Berlin 2 weeks before Kristallnacht in the fall of 1938. He came to America as a young man of 16, alone, on a boat called the St. Louis. For those who know a little bit about Holocaust history, you will know that the next voyage of the St. Louis became the voyage of the damned, with about 1,500 refugees from Nazi Europe coming within eyesight of the shores of America, first Miami Beach and then up the East Coast, rejected by an American policy that was not going to let in any more refugees. Sound familiar? Sent back to Europe where half of the people, the refugees, perished. My mother's family is from Poland. They had a brief respite in Germany, but my grandparents, sensing the rise of Nazism, decided we're not staying here. They moved to pre-state Israel, then called Palestine. My grandfather couldn't make a living, so he brought the family to America where my mom and dad met and started a family. For my parents, Jewish identity was not optional. Their world was the synagogue, was activity with the United Jewish Appeal, with my mom being involved with Hadassah, with my dad being the president of the synagogue. That was the world they were comfortable in. That's what they understood and who understood them. Along comes me and my siblings. For us, Jewish identity was optional. There were no barriers to our entry into American society, thank goodness. And yet what kept me tied to the Jewish experience and what solidified my Jewish identity were several experiences through my young adult years, which were experienced by my entire generation, what I call heroic moments. I'll mention just two. I could mention many more. In my teen years, I remember the weeks leading up to the Six-Day War in 1967. At that time, Israel was not even 20 years old. No one, not in Israel, not in the Jewish community, not in military, political precincts around the world, nobody expected that Israel would have the ability to defend herself against anywhere between 2 to 5 invading Arab armies. And the fate of the Jews who had gone to Israel as a refuge from Nazi Europe. It seemed we're going to face the fate that was promised by Arab leaders like Nasser, saying, we will annihilate every last man, woman, and child who's Jewish in that state that is imposturing as the state of Israel. So you can understand why, when the war broke out in June of '67, and the war was won by the Israeli army in 6 days, it was experienced as a miracle. It also led to a tremendous outgrowth of pride on the part of Jews who now said, we are people who will not again be victims, but who will actually be able to defend ourselves to control our own destiny and our own future. The second such experience, which was formative in my identity, was my activism with the Soviet Jewry movement, the movement to free Soviet Jews. From the beginning of communism in the early 20th century, some 3 million Jews were trapped, imprisoned in the Soviet Union, neither free to practice their religion nor free to emigrate. And frankly, the Soviet Jewry movement, which was kind of the cause du jour of my early teen and young adult years, was an expression of the phrase I mentioned earlier, all of Israel is responsible one for the other. We were not going to leave them alone. We were going to act in solidarity with them. I spent over 20 years as an activist for Soviet Jewry, made many trips back and forth, solidarity trips where I met with some of the great heroes of my generation who were at risk of life and liberty, going to practice Judaism, teach Hebrew, and advocate to emigrate to Israel. The climax moment of the Soviet Jewry movement is a moment and an event that I had a hand in. It happened on December 6th, 1987. That day was a Sunday, the day before then Premier Mikhail Gorbachev was going to meet then President Ronald Reagan for a summit meeting at the White House. And the Jewish community knew this was an opportunity to make a statement about how the world stood in solidarity with Soviet Jews. I was at that time the executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, Greater Washington, with all the political and public policy responsibility for the community. And we were working together with national Jewish agencies to plan the rally, which was not without risk. If you don't have enough people turning out, it's a statement of political impotence and not political power. Our best guess estimate of the attendance at that rally on a day when the wind chill was about 0 was 25,000 people. And we planned for transportation for that number. And I will remember till my dying day, standing on the podium behind the Capitol with the expanse of the mall in front of us and in the far distance, the Lincoln Memorial, symbols of our own liberty here in America. Standing next to then Vice President George Bush, recently released refugees Natan Sharansky, human rights hero Elie Wiesel, getting a message from my staff that our transportation system had totally broken down because we didn't get 25,000 people. 250,000 people came to the mall that day to stand in solidarity with Jews who were not free to either practice their religion or leave the country. The next day, that rally was the lead story, page 1 of the New York Times and the Washington Post. And Ronald Reagan picked up the paper and put it in front of Mikhail Gorbachev's face. He says, Mr. Gorbachev, 250,000 Americans came out to say what they felt about what you were doing to your Jews. Understand this. There will be no trade. There will be no détente. There will be no peace until you let the Jews go. Within a year of that rally, actually less than that, emigration rates went from the dozens to the tens of thousands. Over the course of the next decade, almost 1 million Soviet Jews left Russia for Israel, Europe, and America. And that rally was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. I tell you that story because it made me feel that I was personally standing in the narrative arc of the Bible. A narrative arc that talks about the journey from slavery to freedom, me'avdut lecherut. And that I was experiencing God's redemptive hand in history. That was core to my Jewish identity. comes the next generation, my children's generation, Generation X, Y, and the millennials, beginning those born in 1980 and beyond. Now, I've got 3 great children. They're 28, 30, and 32. I love them dearly, and they are like the children of Lake Wobegon, above average. I won't say more. But their generation has a totally different set of experiences than my generation. During their childhood and their formative years, Israel no longer is a source of unity, it's a source of division. The Jewish community is divided over Israel and where it's going to move in the future. They lived during a time when the intermarriage rate went from my generation in the 30 percentiles to now we see that among non-Orthodox Jews, intermarriage is at the 70% rate. And while on one level you can say intermarriage is a sign of the Jewish acceptance into America, on another level, if you care about the issue of passing down the tradition, it's a challenge. The identity of the millennials, of my children's generation, is far more global than it is tribal. And I use the word tribal not in any pejorative way, because I am a tribal Jew through and through. It's the way I define being part of the community of faith. I identify with the past, present, and future of the Jewish people. But for my children's generation, their identity is far more global than it is tribal. And this explains our crisis of faith. It explains why it is that the array of institutions that have been built by the Jewish community over the last century, legacy organizations like Jewish federations that raise money and allocate for all good causes, synagogues, membership organizations like Hadassah B'nai B'rith, and Jewish community centers, which are centers for culture and sports and literature and arts. All those 4 sectors are in steep decline over the past 25 years on any measurement. The next generation is simply not joining and not supporting these legacy organizations from which they've come. Put this into the context of America. It's interesting because this is the book that was cited by Rabbi Sachs this morning, but I'm going to cite a different piece of it. In the book American Grace, written by Robert Putnam and David Campbell, they look at the issue of what they call religious inheritance. What they mean by that is, to what extent is one generation successful at passing on their traditions, their practices, their rituals from one generation to the next? And what they find from their study is the following: that if you exclude African Americans and Hispanics, parentheses, footnote, why do they exclude them? Because those communities, still very much at risk in America, are tied to their faith communities, to their churches, much more assiduously than are the rest of white America. So if you take blacks and Hispanics out of the sample, about 50% of Americans are successful at religious inheritance. 1 in 2 families pull it off. I, of course, went to the back of the book and looked at all the religious denominations, checked out the Jews. Our line comes in at about 30%, one of the lowest in America, meaning only 1 in 3 Jewish households will successfully pass on Jewish identity to the next generation. Now, with all that, the question is, why am I actually an optimist about the Jewish future? And I am, with all that I've just said. And partly my optimism is driven by the fact that I've spent most of my rabbinic career working with young people. Bill mentioned that I built an organization called Panim that over 21 years touched the lives of over 20,000 Jewish young people, using the values and wisdom of the Jewish tradition to inspire a life of activism, justice, and service to the world, not just to Jews, but to the world. And over the years, the 21 years that I worked with Panim and interacted with all these young people, I was so inspired by the fact that even as they rejected many of the tribal elements of Jewish identity, which matters a lot to their parents, they were living out values that were core and covenantal core teachings of the Jewish tradition. Engage in a conversation with the millennial and you'll see how much they care about the idea and the belief that every human being is made in the image of God, however they define God, which says that you need to act in a certain way when people are at risk, making them activists for human rights. Talk to a millennial and you'll see the extent to which they care about the vulnerable in their populations, Talk to a millennial and see the extent to which they are so much more focused on the extent to which we have poisoned our planet, put our future as a planet at risk, and their desire to essentially treat God's earth in a very different way than our generation has. Ironically, these Jews who some would call post-tribal, and there's a lot of literature that calls my children's generation post-tribal. They don't want anything to do with these institutional affiliations. I prefer to call them covenantal because their core makeup and DNA is so much aligned with the core teachings of the Torah, of the way Judaism teaches Jews to live their lives every day. And here's another piece of irony. While the leaders of tribal Jewish organizations like synagogues and federations and JCCs will bemoan the fact that the next generation is gone AWOL, the millennials will judge those institutions by covenantal values, and guess what? Those legacy organizations don't measure up all that well, which explains why they're going AWOL. To say the least, there's a gap between my optimism about the Jewish future and the attitude of a lot of the stewards and leaders of synagogues and Jewish organizations who think that it's all going away. Here's the inconvenient truth that they need to hear, though. The programs of many churches and synagogues make sense only to the loyalists. And by loyalists, I mean the people who have built, maintained, and populate those institutions. And that includes many of you. It only makes sense to them. Millennials experience those institutions as having confused ends and means. Millennials are very mission-driven as covenantal Jews. And they have no patience for institutions that are long on form and short on substance. Millennials are not interested in hearing another sermon about social justice. They've had it with that. They want to go on the front lines and march with Black Lives Matter or with William Barber's Repairers of the Breach to address this country's historic prejudice against racism, against blacks. It's racism in America. Millennials are not interested in reading another piece of liturgy about God's creation. They want to start an urban farm or move to a farm. Millennials are not interested in hearing a lot of God talk when the religion being preached does not lead to hands-on acts of justice and compassion. Millennials take due note of the fact that oftentimes within 4 or 5 blocks of their churches and synagogues, there are 3 to 4 homeless people sleeping on the street. And in over a decade or more, no one has done anything to bring any of them in from the cold. Millennials are asking the question, what institutions, what organizations are walking the talk of prophetic faith? Not just talking the talk, but walking the talk. And they act accordingly. A project that I now lead, and we're in our infancy really, in our 3rd year, has grown out of my experience working with the next generation, with millennials. It's called Kinisa, Communities of Meaning Network, and it requires a little explanation of the 2 terms. Kinisa is the Hebrew word for entranceway. If you go to Israel, you'll see over the door, where in America it would say exit with red letters, you would see the word in Hebrew lettering Kinisa at buildings in Israel. So why do I use that term to describe our national project? Because I wanted to ask the question, what doors are millennial Jews willing to walk through to experience Jewish identity? Think about the Jewish experience as a large house with many rooms in it. And 1 or 2 or 3 of those rooms happen to be conventional institutions like synagogues or JCCs or federations. But there are other rooms there as well. And Kinisa is asking the question, what doors are younger Jews willing to walk through if they're not willing to walk through those conventional doors? And communities of meaning is because as I've done more and more work with that generation, what I find is that they stand suspicious of the term religion, and they're not even fully sure they want to embrace the term spiritual. Some are and some aren't, which explains what the project is all about. And our mandate, what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify, convene, and build capacity among what are now turning out to be hundreds of emerging spiritual or communities of meaning all over the country. It's quite remarkable. I've identified 4 themes, or if you will, 4 doors, which actually represent what it is that is compelling to the next generation. And I want to suggest, for those of you who are involved in your churches and your synagogues, that these themes, these doorways, need to be made much more manifest in the work that we're doing in our legacy organizations. The 4 themes. The first one is the word, Bill, you tried to say before. You did it pretty well, actually. Chokhmah, which means wisdom. Jews are fascinated by the rich bank of Jewish literature that's been developed over the centuries. You know, Jews have been involved in a century-long conversation with our core texts, with the Torah. And so, in fact, what happens is that one rabbinic commentator makes a comment in the 10th century, and the response comes in the 14th century, and I can stand in front of my synagogue in Bethesda, Maryland, in the 21st century and engage in the conversation with a 10th century and 14th century commentator. That's the richness of the tradition. And unlike previous generations, for whom synagogues believe the only way you can deliver Judaism is by offering Jewish light, L-I-T-E, this next generation is so serious about Jewish learning that they're engaging in serious Jewish study that far extends beyond what most Jews of the prior generation ever thought to engage in. The second theme is tzedek, the Hebrew word for social justice. No sector of the Jewish community has grown as rapidly as the social justice sector. If you want to see where next generation Jews are going, follow their feet. They are actively engaged in all manners of social justice, both domestically and internationally. Third theme or door is what I call kihila, the Hebrew word for community, but I add the adjective covenantal community. Many of our synagogues and churches throw around the word community all too cavalierly, and I won't have it. Because millennials see through it. You can use the word, but community has to mean something. The vast majority of churches and synagogues are actually transactional institutions where people pay a fair market price for an array of goods and services. That's a membership organization. A covenant of communities where people have expectations about being devoted in heart and mind and soul to the mission of the institution and to the people who make it up. It looks very different than most of our churches and synagogues, though a handful of synagogues and churches are moving in this covenantal direction, and we should applaud that. Fourth and finally, the 4th theme is the word kiddusha. Kiddusha gets translated in many cases as holiness, but I define it slightly differently. I say kiddusha represents the desire of Jews to live lives of sacred purpose. For some, the word kiddusha might mean God, and for others, it might not. But what unites all the Jews that we're identifying is their desire to lead lives of sacred purpose. But we're finding out in our work is that there are dozens, hundreds of these emerging spiritual communities that are boutique organizations that are hyper-focused on one of these themes. And that's where millennials are getting their experience with communities of meeting. And they're joining those in lieu of joining synagogues. Now, I want to give you a window into the larger American picture here to show what it means. How many of you have heard the term multiple discovery? Anyone know what that means? Multiple discovery. Okay, here goes. Multiple discovery is a phenomenon of which you might be aware of when the Nobel Committee gives out a prize in chemistry. And they give the award to 3 scientists, one who lives in Peru, and one who lives in Chicago, and one who lives in Paris. And you find out, when you do a little bit of the homework, that actually they spent the first decade of their work not knowing about each other. And they've discovered something remarkable at more or less the same time. It happens not only in the natural sciences, but in the social sciences. And I had a very profound experience of multiple discovery in my work with emerging communities of meaning. I was very dedicated not to do my work in a Jewish silo bubble, because I knew that what I was seeing among the Jewish community was happening in the larger American landscape. And so I spent almost a year trying to find a national Christian organization that would want to work with me in partnership doing this work. I had some nice conversations, but I never found a dance partner. And then someone sent me a citation for a small study called How We Gather, which was written by 2 graduate students at Harvard Divinity School named Casper ter Kuile and Angie Thurston. I read their study and my jaw dropped. They were asking all the questions that I was asking, and their study actually profiled 10 emerging communities of meaning. Multiple discovery. I was using the term, and they were using the term. They uncovered an array of organizations which parallels what I was finding in the Jewish community. I'll give you a couple of examples. How many of you have heard of the dinner party? The dinner party. Not your dinner party, the dinner party. Okay, so there are a handful. How did it start? It started in 2013 with a young woman named Lennon Flowers who lived in Los Angeles. In her senior year in college, her mother passed away. And as she tried to re-enter into her life, she couldn't find people to talk with who understood the hole in her soul that was left by the death of her mother. And so she reached out to a handful of friends who were not as close to her, but who had suffered loss of a significant other. And she says, let's have a potluck dinner, come together and talk about our shared experience of loss. Thus got launched the first dinner party. Today, the dinner party is a nonprofit organization. It exists in 140 cities around the US and overseas. Young millennials trying to find a place to talk about loss and experience compassion and understanding. You would say that's what churches and synagogues should be doing, but young people are reinventing that experience through the dinner party. Or a second organization that Casper and Angie profile called The Sanctuaries, which is in my backyard in Washington, D.C. It was started by a Unitarian minister named Eric Wesley, who wanted to essentially come up with a multi-faith way to explore justice through the arts. This past February, I was on the Bima leading services at Adat Shalom in Bethesda, and we dedicated that Shabbat to Black History Month. I reached out to Eric Wesley, and I said, why don't you bring your team to Adat Shalom, and I will give you my sermon slot. So they came to our synagogue on Shabbat morning, and in the course of 25, 30 minutes, we had a Muslim, a Hindu, a Sikh, a Jew, Hispanic, and an African American, each offering poetry, reflections, narratives, and artwork expressing their experience of racism in America. A more profound sermon my people had never heard. That's the Sanctuaries. It's a new model of how young people are experiencing faith, community, covenantal relationship. Even more remarkably than the examples that Casper and Angie found that paralleled mine is that after they did this study of 10 organizations, they decided to say, what are the themes that are common to the various groups that we've uncovered? And again, before we met, they came up with a list of themes that were almost identical to the 4 themes that I came up with using Hebrew phrases. We're now working collaboratively together. It's been a very rich collaboration. The last piece of the story. In January of this year in Austin, Texas, we convened a meeting. We meaning myself along with the How We Gather project. We had in a meeting in Austin, Texas, the leadership of 10 major national denominations: Episcopal, Methodist, Presbyterian, Unitarian, United Church of Christ. I brought in the Jews, Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, and Reconstructionist Judaism. Why were they there? If you read the press releases from these national denominations, they'll tell you how great they're doing. But in the privacy of their own conversations, they know that they are dramatically losing market share, and you know that as well. And they came together to say, what are you guys learning? What are you guys seeing about the next generation that we need to understand because we want to save our ship? Here's what I would say to them in short, and with this I'll close. For 30 years now, we in America have seen an erosion of the American public square. An American public square, which I would argue is at the heart of American pluralist democracy. The assumption that people will come from different countries, of different faiths, of different races, of different ideologies, and come together in the public square and discuss with each other what is in the common good for America. That erosion started 30 years ago, and it's getting worse and worse. And the evaporation of that public square led to the fact that we can no longer engage in civil and civic dialogue, which has led to the fact of growing partisanship and a divide and a paralysis of the American political system. At a time that our technological capabilities expands exponentially, we've lost the talent and the ability to engage in acts of human compassion and friendship. At a time when we need Dr. King's beloved community more than ever before, we don't have a clue how to create it. The fact that our children are not joining the congregations developed by our generation does not mean that they're not desperate to find their own communities of meaning. They are, in fact, creating those communities right under our noses. We just don't recognize it. What we call a crisis of faith is less an indictment of the next generation than it is an indictment of our lack of imagination. Our children want to live lives of sacred purpose. They're creating new models of communities of meaning that will do the job better than the institutions that we have created. We should wish them wisdom, fortitude, and courage. They will need it. It ain't easy. But they will do it their own way. If we can be humble enough to resist judging them, if we take the time to listen to them, we just may learn from them how to create a more just and loving world. Thank you.
I don't want to break the spell that you've cast upon us of reason and I don't want to break the spell that you've cast over 1,000 or so people. Seriously, that was a powerful reordering of my Rubik Cube in terms of the elements that go into thinking about religion. You really did turn some things around in my mind. And that, for one thing, it made me think that if Moses had known that the promised land was on the other side of the Red River and not the Red Sea, he could have had all of these texts, and you could have been the chief rabbi of the Chautauqua colony and all of its affiliated provinces. Seriously, that was terrific, and we have 15 minutes. Did I hear you say that what they're looking for is meaning and purpose, the millennials, but that meaning and purpose are not necessarily associated with religion? Did I hear that, or was I mishearing?
No, it's true. They don't find it in most of our religious institutions. There's a phenomenon which is actually not unique to religious communities, that organizations that get born out of a deep sense of mission and purpose, as they get larger, they get organizational sclerosis. They start to kind of like lose their way because they get bigger and bigger and they're doing many, many things. Most churches and synagogues would identify with the four themes I mentioned. But they'll say, because I've had the conversation with the rabbis and ministers, we do wisdom, we do justice, we do this, we do that, but when you do it all, you don't do any of it all that well, frankly. And furthermore, the mission-driven passion of the next generation is such that they don't recognize the things that they most care about. They see a lot of structure and bureaucracy and they don't experience kind of the hands-on work that they really care about.
Do you hear any of them say what has become the cliche in the millennial world, I'm spiritual but not religious?
Many, yes, not all of them to a person. I think that's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole piece. Let me tell a quick story about synagogues and churches of purpose. I want to tell a story about one of my spiritual heroes, who was a Lutheran minister named John Steinbrook. He just passed away this past year. Anybody know John Steinbrook from Washington? John was, yeah, of course. John was amazing. He moved to Washington in the mid-1970s when downtown Washington was decaying, as was much of urban America. And what was once a thriving parish, his members were all moving to the suburbs. It's the kind of church that, we could tell the story 100 times, would have closed down, but for one fact. John said, if you walk around the block, I just saw 100 people sleeping on the street. We now have a dozen Sunday school classrooms that are empty on Sunday mornings because they're all in the suburbs. Let's bring the homeless into our church. He had a board meeting. How many people are members of boards of churches or synagogues? So you can imagine the board meeting. John says, Reverend Steinberg says, we're going to bring the homeless into the church. And the board says, insurance, security, safety, the building is all going to go to hell. And John looked him in the eyes and says, we don't debate God in church. And he insisted that he bring him in. Today, if you go down to Lutheran Place Church, not only did the church revive itself, John became a Pied Piper for dozens of churches and synagogues in Washington, all of whom were guilted into service to the homeless community in Washington. And today, where once were crumbling tenement buildings filled with drug addicts and the like, you now find N Street Village, a multi-million-dollar complex with a continuum of care. This is a church finding its purpose, but it's one in 1,000.
So, are synagogues not essential to Jewish spirituality, even to the crisis of continuity? That's what turned my head around in thinking about what you said. Are synagogues no longer necessary to what I would call Jewish spirituality? You would say is Jewish continuity. What do you think?
I would say synagogues and churches can and should be central, but they've got to change their game. What worked for a previous generation no longer works. I'll use my own synagogue as an example. We started at Dach Shalom in 1988. And in the first 5 years, about 80% of the people who joined our synagogue would have said, we'd never had any intention to join any synagogue, period, ever, 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 even for a bar bat mitzvah. Why are we drawing them in? Because we announced ourselves as a community that was welcoming both seekers and skeptics who were committed to advancing justice in the world. That was our theme, and people came to know us by that. Now, they weren't saying like, I need a place to go Friday night or Shabbat morning. That wasn't happening. That doesn't describe more than 2 of the people who we found in our first 100 families. We're now at 500 families. Ask a member of Dach Shalom, what do they identify with? They'll tell you what they identify the synagogue with. We've adopted a community in Haiti, which we've built up from a group of 12 Haitian kids in a destroyed building from the earthquake to a school of 200 kids, K-6. They'll tell you about the fact that outside of our social hall, we have an organic garden. And on some Shabbat mornings, you have a couple of dozen people working in the garden to essentially harvest food that will go to a soup kitchen and then join for the luncheon with everyone. Or they'll tell you about the fact, the pride they have in that we probably had more members of our synagogue leading the effort for marriage equality in Maryland, a bill that passed, than any other house of worship in the entire state. That's what they're proud of. Now, once you engage people in that kind of work, they come together for the worship because they're the fellow travelers. We're doing holy work together. And the way Jews gather is to sing and pray and read and hear an inspiring lesson from the Torah that is aligned with what we care about doing.
So if they go through these 4 doors and they do holy work, as is often done outside of any physical structure, ultimately, though, do they have the patience to build new and modern institutions more likely to incarnate their vision, as synagogues in Marshall, Texas were built to symbolize and contain and incarnate an ancient tradition and a present tradition working its way through my small town?
So that's a great question, and I would say the jury is out.
Say what?
The jury is out on that. In other words, it's not clear that they either have the know-how or the stick-to-itiveness or the resources to do it. In measure, my Knesset Network project is all about doing that. We're trying to build capacity among the young people who have a certain suspicion of becoming another organization, right? They want to do the work, but they don't want to build structures. And as has been said well this week, we actually need communal structures to essentially pass on values and traditions and customs that go from one generation to the next. The jury is out.
Well, I'm serious. You have a very powerful vision contained in that speech you made and the thinking you've been doing. I want to urge the people to go over and get a copy of the book, Jewish Megatrends, Charting the Course of the American Jewish Future, because if you're a Christian or anything else, this book has some vital resources for you to think about. I know we just have time for one question on each side, so I'm going to ask the first person to get there, if the others would just wait until Friday, and if the first person, I'm going to take your name off of Friday. Go right ahead, Kurt.
So, you speak with great passion, and in my limited experience at Chautauqua, I've never heard more passion than from you. So thank you for that. It's not often that one meets people who have stood in the arc of history, other than Bill, of course. And to do so requires courage, which, as many of us have been encouraged this week from our daily sermons, should do, but we're scared. So how would you coach us to have courage, to do more of what you've done, to have the conversations that you've had, and those you recommend?
Thank you, Kurt.
Appreciate the question. I'm going to quote my dear and departed friend, Reverend Steinbrook. John used to say, "The heaviest burden is having no one to carry." The heaviest burden is having no one to carry. And I think what being part of John's theology is to say that we are forbidden to take solace simply in personal salvation. That is not, and I'm quoting John now, I'm not a scholar of Christianity. He says that is not the teachings of the gospel. It is not the teachings of the New Testament. It is not what Jesus would have had us do. And I would say the same thing with a bit more confidence to my Jewish friends and colleagues, that you need to walk the talk. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who many of you know of, who walked with Dr. King in Birmingham and was an iconic figure in the civil rights movement, was also a professor of Jewish theology at the Jewish Theological Seminary. But when he went to Selma to march with Dr. King, he said, "I felt that I was praying with my feet." And that phrase, I have to tell you, that I meet young Jews who can't even say Aleph Bet, the Hebrew alphabet. They don't have the basic knowledge of Judaism, and they will quote back to me Heschel's line, because that spoke to their hearts. Praying with our feet. So you've got to put your feet ahead of the hymnal. Pray with your feet and then sing a song, Hallelujah, because you're doing the hard work together. It is scary to be out there. And I do work, I spent about 7 years through my work with my foundation organizing some of the leading social political activists in Washington who are all Jewish. I mean, I should say it differently. I worked with the Jews. There are many Jews and non-Jews involved with the work, but there's a disproportionate number of Jews who are leading national nonprofits, working in Congress, working in various advocacy efforts. And what I was experiencing was that many of them, as I met them, were saying that we have no Jewish background. I mean, we're Jewish by lineage, but we don't know anything about Judaism. So I ran a policy leader group, these people, top echelon, once a month studying with me Jewish core texts. And here's what they found. They were saying that some of them, I remember, in fact, some probably, I don't think I'm sharing confidence. Some of you might know the name Peter Edelman, who's married to Marian Wright Edelman.
Sure.
Peter Edelman, who's a professor at Georgetown Law School, was oftentimes mentioned as a potential Supreme Court nominee. Not now, but anyway. And his wife is the leader of the Children's Defense Fund, doing amazing work in the world, okay? So Peter Edelman was the caliber of people in the room. Peter said at one of our study sessions, he says, I've been doing civil rights work since the Bobby Kennedy days. I went to the South with Bobby Kennedy. He says, I can't tell you the level of despair that I feel that 35 years later, we are in a worse position than we were when I was with Bobby Kennedy in Mississippi. And he was looking for a faith ground to stand on. Didn't mean he wanted to get religion. Didn't mean he wanted to join the synagogue. It meant he needed something, the question you asked yesterday. What is the core of you asked this yesterday to the speaker. What are you standing on that means you're doing good in the world that has some kind of eternal meaning and purpose that's been passed down through the generation? Where is that groundwork? So what I would say is, yes, we need courage. Because to do the work, real work of justice in our world today, it's needed more than ever before, but it's easy to despair. It is easy to lose hope. And it is easy to lose your way. And I would think that's where our churches and synagogues can and should play a role, but we need to lead with our feet, and only afterwards with the hymnal.
Amen.
Here we go. 1 minute.
Hello, I'm Mary Kitchen. I'm a Presbyterian minister. And I was very interested when you mentioned about a convocation that had been held recently with many different denominations and faith traditions. And I'd like to know just a little bit more about what came from that and how I can read more about the results of that.
Okay, that's an easy one. Come see me afterwards. There's a paper just came out that resulted from that meeting. And I'm not sure because my colleagues, Casper and Andrew, are going to run with that project, not I. I'm not sure where they're going to take it next, but I can actually give you the citation so you can get the study and be in contact with them.
Can you tell us the name of the meeting so we know how to Google it or whatever?
Was not named. It was undercover. People came in with masks on. They didn't want to be identified.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much for that question, and you will get that information from Sid. And thanks to all of you for being here. At this stage in a Baptist service, we either pass the collection plate or we ask for a call and response. I'm asking you for a call or response, and we'll see you over on the porch of the House of Mission. Thank you for a marvelous presentation.